Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And want to start off this episode by thanking all of our viewers. Kind of an amazing fact here. This is episode number 200 of this Oakland A's series in Out of the Park Baseball 25. So it's been something that we've been at since a couple weeks after the new game came out and the first patch or two was released. And we're a couple of days away from having this series run from the calendar year 2024 into 2025. And although I still might be doing it without the viewers, the interaction and the support and the conversations and the comments that we have on this channel definitely make it much more interesting for me to be playing this game, and they certainly keep me interested and motivated to continue playing with these A's, engaging with the audience, and creating new content than I probably would be if I was just doing this on my own. So thanks again for sticking with this series, and thanks to all of you who have given us some feedback to our questions from the last episode. Obviously, open to any and all suggestions and feedback at any time following the episodes. But at the end of the last episode, I did have a couple of specific questions I asked. And when I do that, definitely like to give at least 24 hours for viewers to potentially respond and share their feedback. The episodes when I typically do that are around the amateur draft, the first year player draft, which is where we are today. And then I also typically do that around the international amateur free agent period in January. And there certainly can be other times during the season when we're facing a big free agent decision or trade decision, and I kind of open things up for the audience specifically to comment on some decisions we have ahead of us. So although given that it is the weekend right now and I have a little more time on my hands, only 24 hours between episodes this time, so I'm sure some of you who haven't caught up on the previous episode yet may share your thoughts on it, and unfortunately I won't be able to integrate those into my decision making. But that being said, do appreciate all the feedback. And I'm almost feeling the last several weeks I haven't been releasing as many episodes on Sundays, just because even for this little niche channel of ours, I recognize that the NFL is king and it's pretty hard to compete with the NFL. And sometimes those episodes just kind of get missed. But this weekend, the NFL schedule, the 1 o'clock Sunday games, is absolutely horrible. I mean, certainly it has to do with the fact that this past week we had Wednesday games, a Thursday game, multiple games on Saturday, and I think those games were all over between Netflix, Amazon, NFL Network, NFL.net, probably other places that hit these games on as well. I didn't pay attention to a lot of them. As those of you who have watched me over the years know, I'm a Jets fan, so I will get to see the Jets play the Bills today. And sadly, these 1 o'clock games are so brutal. I think the Jets, Bills, and the Eagles and the Cowboys, which are a couple of divisional matchups featuring really good teams against teams that are not so good, are probably the two highlights of the 1 o'clock games here on the penultimate week of the NFL season, which is a sad state of affairs, but obviously a lot of good games over the last several days, and we still will have some 4 p.m. Sunday night and Monday night games this week. But the 1 o'clock NFL slot is lacking quality today, and makes me a little more eager to get an episode out there, because I'm guessing some of you may have the same opinion and may want to spend a little time with old school sports as you while away your Sunday. Back to the two questions that we specifically asked at the end of the last episode. One of them involved potential trade, And at this point, we don't have a lot of weaknesses on this Oakland A's team. We're 58-34, best record in the AL, and a big lead in the American League West. But if we've got one weakness on the team, it's probably center field. And we talked in the last episode about potentially pursuing Walker Jenkins, who can certainly play center field and who was on the trade block from the Marlins. The negatives for Jenkins are he's 35 years old and he's wrecked physically and he is a pure rental. And then we also talked about Kamani Ibekwe, who wasn't on the trade block when we first started investigating him, but is on the trade block now. He's more durable, not quite as good defensively as Jenkins is, and not quite as good a hitter at this point against right-handed pitching, even though they are both accomplished left-handed hitters who would be in platoon roles for us, playing primarily against right-handed pitching while playing center field. And several of you opined on what we should do. Nobody thought Ibekwe was the right choice, which is kind of interesting to me because I do think he's definitely a better hitter against right-handed pitching than our current center fielder, Sergio Palomares. He's very similar defensively to Sergio Palomares, and he is durable and would give us another left-handed bat. But nobody thought that Ibekwe was the right answer. Walker Jenkins got support from both Avery Sham and YME943 as the way to go. And certainly if everything worked out well with Jenkins, he would be the biggest upgrade. Left-handed hitter, stronger defensively with that higher error rating and that excellent arm. And his ratings are still pretty good against right-handed pitching. And importantly this year, he's also raking against right-handed pitching with a 304 average, 10 homers, and a 137 WRC+. The concern, as I outlined already, is that he's wrecked physically, and this is a guy that we want in the lineup consistently against right-handed pitching, not just as we're pushing to clinch the number one seed in the American League and possibly all of baseball, but also for the playoffs. And given his age and his injury status, didn't feel that it was necessarily the most prudent move, but obviously Avery Sham and YME943 feel differently. And I can't argue with that. If Jenkins is healthy, bringing him on board is the most impactful move that we could make. Clearly the big if is around his health. Unfortunately, though, in the 2 weeks since we started the last episode, Walker Jenkins has decided he would rather stick with a last-place Miami Marlins team, and he's exercising his 10-5 rights to veto any trade. Clearly, that might change over the next 3 weeks. The Marlins 21.5 out in the NL East in last place, as I mentioned, and 9.5 out of a wild card. You would think that the opportunity to join a team that's almost assured of making the playoffs and has a 7.5 game lead in the division and is very well positioned with the AL East being a bit down this year to have a first round bye, and then he'd get to hit the free agent market anyways, go back to Miami if he wants. You would think that would be an attractive option for him, but unfortunately it's not at this moment. Something that we'll continue to monitor. And then the last option that was brought up was just sticking with Sergio Palomares, who we still do have option on next year. Hasn't been as productive offensively as we would hope this season. Basically been a slightly below league average offensive player this year. Still has put up a WAR of close to 2, but he's been disappointing against right-handed pitching, which is where he's been playing primarily with just an 84 WRC+. But Scott Donovan and Coach 1549 felt that the upgrades weren't significant enough, and losing the optionality on Palomares next year, as well as the other players that we would have to include. Felt like sticking with Palomares made sense. Paul West also thought made sense to not trade away Palomares for Jenkins or Ibekwe, but he did suggest looking into some potential additional opportunities to maybe pick up someone different at a different position from shopping Palomares. There were some options there, but nothing that I felt was particularly compelling. So I think at this point we're still in a bit of a holding pattern. We could go down any of those three routes, keeping Palomares, trading him for Ibekwe, trading him for Jenkins, although the Jenkins route right now is a path that is not passable, given that at least for the time being, he's not willing to accept a trade. And the other question that we asked for help from the Worldwide Scouting Department with at the end of the last episode was perhaps what to do with this first-year player draft, although we're not picking until pick 33 with a supplemental pick that we got for the departure of Juan Ramos as a free agent last offseason. We've got two of the next five picks, number 33 and 37. And as always, the Worldwide Scouting Department delivered with some interesting information for us to think about. Talk about some of the players that were most highlighted or number one on the list of members of the Worldwide Scouting Department. Shortstop Mike Pardo, 18-year-old out of Fort Worth, Texas, was one of Scott Donovan's recommendations. I do think that the potential outstanding gap power, really good home run power with really good speed, and a left-handed hitter is a very interesting combination for a middle infielder who looks like he could be pretty solid defensively. Probably not a guy that we'll take in the first round. The mock drafts aren't perfect, but he's expected right now to go with the 25th pick in the third round. So although I'm intrigued by Pardo, I think being patient might make sense with him, and I think that was kind of Scott Donovan's message as well. The guy that we are projected to take with this 33rd pick in the draft is one of the highest rated prospects out there, Bobby Ferrer. Max Taylor recommends him. Clearly the world-class home run power to go with well above average gap power. And an above-average eye is a very interesting combination for the switch-hitting third base prospect. Definitely brings some interesting things to the table. Is looking for a little more than slot in terms of his bonus demand, but not a crippling amount with the money that we do have saved up at this point and also set aside to pay our draftees. The most popular hitter for us to go after, according to the Worldwide Scouting Department, was someone who was projected to go 2 picks earlier with the 31st pick overall in the mock draft, and that's another third baseman, Chris Tabat. Tabat was YME943's top choice. He suggested perhaps looking at players like Goodman and Bracamonte later. Jarek Braxton and Avery Shayam also recommended going with Tabat at third base over Max Taylor. The advantages Tabat has, he's durable physically, and his contact and his ability to avoid strikeouts are both significantly better than what we see with Ferrer. That said, his gap power, his home run power, and his eye are all worse. And his infielder error rating for a third baseman is a little lower right now. Not exceptional speed, but definitely an interesting right-handed hitting third base prospect. I can't say I have an incredibly strong opinion between the two of these guys. I think if we were to go with a third baseman right now, I ultimately probably lean to the majority and go with Tabat. I like the adaptability. I like the durability. I like that he costs a little less. Most importantly, I like that the guy is going to make consistent contact and not strike out a couple hundred times a season, which I think even in a best case development scenario is a possibility for Bobby Farrer. That said, a switch hitting third baseman with world class home run power and a plus I is still an interesting combination to think about. There are two other players that I'll mention hitter-wise that didn't necessarily get number one votes from any of the worldwide scouting department, but that are still interesting to me. The catcher Steve Jackson, who has a potentially outstanding bat, left-handed hitting durable catcher. Not necessarily the greatest defensively, but with his 6'8" height, he could definitely be a more than competent first baseman. So he's still intriguing to me. Probably not someone that I would go with either of these first round picks, but he's projected to go with the 9th pick in the 3rd round, so it's not inconceivable that he would be on the table with our 2nd round selection. The other player I'm going to mention is a guy that I like who likely won't be around by the time we get to the 2nd round. That's the shortstop Doug Ramos. He was actually projected to go 28th overall, so a little surprising that he's still on the board at number 33, but obviously not a huge drop at this point. Right-handed hitting shortstop with some positive personality traits, solid defensively, and a bat that we think can be average to well above average in all of the primary categories. Unfortunately, the gap power, which is perhaps his biggest potential strength, limited a little bit by his below average speed, but still pretty interesting to potentially have a middle infielder with well above average gap power and home run power. So Ramos not on the top of my list, but depending on how the next 4 picks evolve, he could be someone we'd consider with the 2nd pick, but that would really require just about everything going wrong. I do think that I'm a bit more interested in Tabat and possibly Ferrer for him if we are to go with a everyday player here. But those of you who have followed me over the years know that I do have a affection for pitchers, being a failed pitcher myself, and also thinking that it's a useful way to win the game. Dodo Dude liked potentially John Bramlett, followed by, at some point in the draft, Gil Cates. Felt that that stuff could be worked on and improved over time in the development lab and through good coaching. But Cates, interestingly, is not projected to go into the 5th round, so feel like we have a little bit of time with him. As I mentioned, though, the top ceiling prospect, at least according to our scout, is the lefty John Bramlett. Dodo Dude liked him, and Bramlett was ultimately the most popular overall. Scott Donovan and Paul West also liked him. Jarek Braxton liked him as a supplemental pick. 5 picks from now if we ended up going with Tabat first. The lefty is a pretty solid prospect. Only throws 90 miles an hour, which isn't perfect, but excellent stamina, outstanding at holding on runners, an outstanding personality with high adaptability, work ethic, and intelligence, which with our coaching and a big investment in player development probably maximizes the probability that he reaches his full potential. Potential 4 to 5 pitch arsenal if things go really well that could certainly be supplemented in the development lab. And we think his stuff and his control could both be well above average, and think that his movement could be average as well. And interestingly, for an 18-year-old high school pitcher, his stuff and his movement, we think, also have a 40 rating. So he is a guy who, if we pick him up this year, think he can, even at 18 years old, hopefully be pretty effective in the ACL. In Bramlett, we have a higher rating on him than the OSA does. The OSA thinks he's a significantly less interesting prospect than we do, with a lot more potential concerns about his control. So because of that, the mock draft, he's not going until early in the third round. So that would perhaps suggest that we go after one of the position players, and then, as Jarek Braxton recommended, possibly use a supplemental pick on Bramlett to get the best value. However, even though I like a lot of the position players, Tabat, Ferrer, Pardo, Ramos, and Jackson, probably closest to the top of the list, I don't have an incredibly pound the table love for any of them over the others. And I feel like when we get to our next pick, which, as I noted, is only 3 more picks after our pick before we pick again, I feel like possibly all of those players that I mentioned, and at least 2 or 3 of them, will still be on the board. Although we are higher than most teams, presumably on Bramlett, it's not inconceivable that there's another team that likes him as well. And given that he is by far the pitching prospect I like best in this draft, whereas I don't see as much differentiation between some of the hitting prospects, we are going to go with Bramlett number 1. We will take a look for the fun of it just to see what our scout recommends. And he recommends going with Tabat, so he's in line with the majority pick of the position players. As I mentioned, Wyme943, Jarek Braxton, and Avery Shaham all suggested we go with Tabat. Honestly, I hope he falls to us. I think if I had to pick a position player right now, it probably would be Tabat. The recommendation, if we do go with a pitcher, is Bramlett. I think it's low probability that we lose Bramlett over the next few picks, and it's a higher probability that we lose Tabat. So I know some of you are probably shouting at me right now, well, idiot, then just pick Tabat. And I certainly get that logic. But personally, I'm going to, if I can only come out of this draft with Bramlett or Tabat, I want to come out with the guy that I think is the best starting pitching prospect available, with a personality that should be pretty easy to develop, and I think a definite path to being a very useful major league pitcher, and with a little luck in terms of his development, perhaps an outstanding major league starter for many years to come. I'd love to come out of the draft with both Bramlett and Tabat. I think I probably maximize my chance of doing that by taking Tabat first over Bramlett. But with 3 picks until we make a selection, there is a chance that I lose out on Bramlett if I wait, which I would kick myself for. Looking at the mock draft, the only pitcher that's expected to go between these picks is Pig Armstrong, an 18-year-old left-hander to the Phillies who's looking for a ton of money. Given that Bramlett's not looking for a lot of money, I could see him coming off the board if someone else really likes him. Now, Tabat looking for slot is going to be incredibly intriguing. I think if I went with Tabat, it's probably a 80% plus chance that Bramlett is still available with the 37th pick. If I go with Bramlett now, it's definitely closer to a coin flip that Tabat is still on the board. It tells me to go with Tabat now. I may kick myself for doing this, but I think I have to follow the math. And as much as I love Bramlett, and I'm going to be disgusted if he comes off the board in one of the next 3 picks, I think the best chance to get both Tabat and Bramlett is to follow our scouting director recommendation and to take the third baseman Tabat right now and hope that Bramlett doesn't sneak up and get picked in one of the next 3 picks. And fortunately, Bramlett is still on the board. So everything coming up Millhouse for the Oakland A's. Look at the last 3 picks. Shortstop Eric Larson, catcher Randy Russell, who we liked a little bit, although we haven't talked about him this episode, and first baseman Eric Tashida, who was one of the highest regarded prospects, are the 3 that came off the board. But we will go right with Bramlett here with our supplemental pick. And we are going to meet his demand. And with Tabat and Bramlett on board, we've got the number 1 position player and the number 1 pitcher according to the Worldwide Scouting Department. So our first 2 picks have worked out pretty well. So the first 2 picks in the draft have went well. Hopefully some of the other players that we've talked about will be around for our pick at the end of the second round. Before we get to that, though, wanted to talk about a trade that we did make since the end of the last episode. Kind of a little bit out of nowhere on this one, but I don't think it will be shocking to those of you that have followed us closely. And we have traded away Alan Hunsaker. You may remember him, a reliever who we signed as a free agent a year ago, had a solid season for us last year, signed him to a relatively cheap 3-year extension this year with a couple of team options. Great personality in the clubhouse, but he's 34 years old. He's fragile physically. And most importantly, he just hasn't been that good this year with a 5.59 earned run average. Most of our good young starting pitchers are on the major league team right now, and we have a surplus of starting pitchers, but we've also got 3 or 4 pretty good relief prospects in AAA. And given that Hunsaker hasn't pitched well this year, and he's older, and he's not really a huge part of our future, we decided to try to shop him for prospects. And we've got someone back for him that's pretty darn interesting. Now, we also had to include minor league left fielder Albert Serrato, who looks like he could be a useful 4th or 5th outfielder. I don't think, unless he gets really lucky with his development, that he's going to be a big-time major leaguer. But he is hitting .299 with 17 homers and 45 ribbies in 221 at-bats in A-ball for us, where he put up a 190 WRC plus and a 3.2 WAR in the first couple months of the season. You can see that the Marlins have already promoted him to high A-ball. So a good, solid major league reliever on a really attractive contract and a okay outfield prospect. But in return, we got someone who, for these 2, I just felt like we had to roll the dice. First baseman, who we now have trying to learn how to play a little bit of third base, although he's not going to be incredibly effective there, Jeff Shans. And he's an interesting right-handed hitter. He's almost 25 years old, so you can't say that he is a big-time prospect at this point. We did like the fact that he had 2 option years left, so he does give us some flexibility. But he seems like he could be an outstanding contact hitter with great ability stealing bases and outstanding speed, plus gap power, and a pretty good sacrifice bunter. Although, interestingly, he's outstanding at pulling off the sacrifice, but he's horrible at bunting for a hit. I think his power and his eye are both below average, but he did hit 275 in 207 at-bats with Miami last year, and he's hitting 289 in AAA this year. We've placed him on our AAA team. I don't think he's a big-time prospect, but he is a guy who, particularly, if we train him up to at least be able to play third base in a pinch, he could probably play left field for us in a pinch if we needed to, with potentially outstanding ability to make contact with the ball and potentially outstanding speed, as well as his line drive tendencies. I think he could play reasonably well in Oakland. Not someone that we're going to build around, and again, at almost 25 years old, not a big-time prospect, but for a reliever we were likely going to be moving on from at the end of this year, who hasn't been incredibly effective, and a prospect who, albeit being a couple years younger, don't think has the same potential upside as Sean's. Not the most exciting deal in the world, but I felt it was one that we needed to make. Interestingly, Sean's, I meant to mention this earlier, he was a former number 1 overall pick who didn't sign with the Twins. And then 3 years later, he was the 2nd overall pick 3 years ago today by the Marlins. I don't know why he was so highly regarded back then, although I'm sure if we look at his scouting, we will see why. You can see now he still looks like that contact could be interesting and exceptional if he fully develops, but below average power, below average eye. But years ago, everyone kind of viewed him as a five-star type prospect with world-class contact to potentially go with above-average eye and above-average home run power. Hasn't developed into that guy exactly. So you can see why he was a very prized draftee on 2 occasions years ago. I don't want to say he's a reclamation project right now, but as a soon-to-be 25-year-old who's in AAA, you could kind of argue that he's a reclamation project. But again, for a reliever who's aging, that had been performing poorly, that we didn't really need, and a prospect that's not as good as Sean's, felt like, particularly with the fact he's still got 2 more option years ahead of him, he's a player who gives us some interesting optionality as a potential 4A guy over the next few years. Back to the draft, though, and with Tabat and Bramlett really liking the first 2 picks, and we're also in a good spot with Bramlett, whose demand was actually below slot. So feel real good about how those first 2 picks went. Now let's see who's going to be available for us in the second round. Hopefully there will still be some familiar names out there. And pitching-wise, still 3 of the guys that we talked about in the last episode in Cates, Shimate, and the reliever Mike Taylor. Don't know that we chase after any of these guys. Hopefully we're in a situation where some of the batters that we've been talking about are still available. And interestingly, third baseman Bobby Ferrer and catcher Steve Jackson, a couple of guys that we mentioned, along with the shortstop Mike Pardo, who Scott Donovan liked, shortstop Jake Reed, who we mentioned in the previous episode, and center fielder Chris Wilde, all still on the board. So I think there's some interesting options here. Scouting director recommends going with the catcher Steve Jackson. And Ferrer is definitely tempting to me here, but we've already picked a first base, third base type that we liked a bit more with Tabat. And I have a tough time getting over the fact that I just don't think Ferrer is a very good hitter who's going to make a lot of contact. There's a lot to like about him. The switch hitting aspect could make him real interesting, particularly if the contact ends up being materially stronger against one type of pitcher or not. Could turn him into a super platoon type of guy with the rest of his ratings, but no guarantees that that happens. And he also, with that $5 million demand, is now looking for way over slot. We do have extra money that we could potentially use. And I think it's not inconceivable that Ferrer continues to fall. But Steve Jackson has a much more consistent left-handed bat, much better contact, although his gap power, home run power, and eye are all worse. But he's durable. He can play catcher. I think at 6'8", he could play a fine first base if we needed him to. I mean, a 6'8", left-handed hitting catcher. That's like a unicorn, practically. Our scout hasn't led us astray. I think it's conceivable that Pardo, Reed, and or Wild could still be around in the third round. For those keeping score at home, Wild projected to go with the 8th pick in the third round. Pardo projected to go with the 25th pick in the third round. And Reed projected to go right at the top of the fourth round. So no guarantee that all of those guys are still going to be around. But I tend to think that either one of those, at least one of those three, and possibly Ferrer will still be around. I don't think Jackson will be around for our next pick. We did save the money with Bramlett being well below slot. So even though Jackson is looking for more than slot, we're still kind of a little under our expectations through these first three picks if we bring Jackson on board. So I think we go with Jackson here in the second. Hope that one of the four other guys at least is still available in the third round. And then hope when we get to the fourth round that there's still some interesting pitchers on the board. So we're going to go with Jackson here in the third round, or in the second round. Moving on to the third, Ferrer is still around. Pardo is still around. Wild is still around. Unfortunately, Reed, the guy who was projected to go in the fourth round, may have secretly been my favorite of those. We'll have to see exactly when Reed ended up going. Okay, he went very early in the seventh pick of the third round. I liked his personality traits, really liked his defense. He wasn't as exciting offensively as some of the other guys, but I did like the contact and a lot of defensive versatility and defensive quality. If he had been available in the third round, that's probably the direction we would have gone. But we still have some interesting options with Wild, Pardo, and Ferrer. Pitching-wise, Schumann and Taylor still on the board. That means that Cates is gone. He was only projected to go in the fifth round, so obviously someone liked him a little more. We'll take a look at Sean Schumann. Potential 5-pitch guy, high leadership, adaptability, and work ethic. Above average stamina, above average holding on runners. We think his stuff and his movement could both be above average. His control kind of major league average. Another left-handed pitching starting prospect. So certainly someone to consider in the third round. Not looking for a ton of money. I'd love to get a little bit better value. We've got three very different players to think about. Ferrer, we've spent plenty of time talking about, looking for a lot of money for where he's going to be drafted at this point. Shortstop Mike Pardo, really like the speed, like the defense, and that gap power being exceptional with good speed, coupled with home run power that we think is above average. Even though we think his contact and his eye are only kind of average, a left-handed hitting middle infielder with power, speed, and a solid glove is certainly interesting. He's also a guy who's not looking for crazy money. Center fielder Chris Wilde, similar profile actually, pretty average in terms of his contact and his eye. The gap power and the home run power, both well above average if he reaches his full potential. Solid glove in the outfield and good speed, although his base running instincts aren't particularly good right now. I'd obviously love if at least one of these three guys was still around with our 4th round pick, probably pushing my luck a little bit. But I feel that between Shimate, Ferrer, and Wild, at least one of them is going to be around in the 4th round. So we're going to follow the strategy outlined by Scott Donovan and try to pick up the left-handed hitting middle infielder Mike Pardo here in the 3rd round. We'll see if our rolling of the dice continues to work in our favor in terms of who's on the board. Ferrer and Wild both still around in the 4th round. Shimate off the board, though. We may have waited just a little bit too long with him. That's unfortunate, because I would have definitely taken Shimate over those two guys if he had still been around. So feel like we've missed out slightly on the pitcher Shimate in the infielder Reed, but still pretty happy with how the draft has gone overall. Shimate didn't last long after our pick. We picked Pardo 27th, and Shimate went off the board 5th pick in the 4th round. So glad that we ended up with our top pitching prospect with the supplemental 1st round pick, as we're hoping to maybe mix Cates or Shimate into the mix in these 4th or 5th rounds, and unfortunately did not happen. And the big demand definitely seems to be scaring people away from Ferrer. Although the profile isn't ideally what I'd go after, can't argue that he's not good value here. And we do have money to potentially spend. But Chris Wilde is intriguing to me. Similar profile to Prado in that excellent gap power and home run power combination with good defense and decent speed. Our scouting director is recommending Zavad Roseberry, a decent-looking pitching prospect, only a 3-pitch arsenal. He's going to be reliant on that changeup. He's fragile physically. I don't think I'd like him more than either of these hitters. We're going to go with Wild and Max Taylor, if you're still watching. If Ferrer is around in the 5th round, we'll definitely grab him. Unfortunately, he goes off the board, so sorry, Max. I'm sure you wish that we had taken him much earlier. Ferrer ended up going to the Mets with the 15th pick in the 5th round, so it'll save us a little bit of money to have lost out on him. It feels like these last few rounds we've definitely lost out on some of the players that we really wanted, but when we put the whole first 4 rounds of this draft together with Tabat, Bramlett, Jackson, Pardo, and Wild, I think it's still a pretty interesting combination of players that we brought together. And I've spent some time offline thinking about the 5th round. Our scout recommends Josh Cancel, a switch hitting shortstop who's durable. The bat doesn't look all that great. I think he's kind of highly rated because he's a two-way prospect, but even if he reaches his full potential in batting, I don't think he's a major leaguer. And even if he reaches his full potential in pitching, I don't think he's a major leaguer. Probably a really interesting 4A kind of player, but 5th round, I'm still looking for a little more than that. We're going to go with Marquis Wack, a second catcher, 18-year-old right-handed hitting catcher, another guy who's pretty average defensively at this point, but we think the bat for a catcher could certainly be interesting. Hopefully could make the glove a little better over the next few years and turn him into a decent backup catcher at the very least. No guarantees, but I think between the catcher Jackson that we picked in the 2nd round and then picking up Marquis Wack here in the 5th round, definitely helping our catching situation across the organization. Obviously, for those of you who have been following us closely, went with a, we hope, big-time young catcher, Mr. Zuebria, in the IAFA period at the start of this year as well. So some good prospects wearing the tools of ignorance joining our organization. So as we sit here 5 rounds into the draft, feel pretty good about how it went. Can certainly argue that in both the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rounds, there were guys that we were hoping would fall to us in those rounds that were no longer on the board. But I still don't know that I would have taken any of those guys over the players that we picked in the round before. So although the draft didn't work out perfectly lucky in terms of us getting everyone that we would have hoped for, Tabat, Bramlett, Jackson, Pardo, Wild, and Marquis Wack is a pretty nice 6 picks over the first 5 rounds here in 2040. And nothing too exciting happened over the last 15 rounds of the draft. I can see in the 6th, 7th, and 10th rounds, we did take players who had demands more than slots. We're just going to try to get them all signed. We've got a little bit of extra money this year. So all in all, I think it was a successful draft, but we'll know more on whether or not that assessment is accurate or not about a decade from now in game time. And with the draft concluded, we'll call it an episode. Thanks again for everyone in the Worldwide Scouting Department for your thoughts on the draft, your thoughts what we should do in the trade market. Obviously, things still in flux as far as the Palomares, Ibekwe, and Jenkins potential to be our center fielder over the rest of the season. We've got 20 days until we get to the trade deadline at this point, so whether or not we make one or multiple additional moves will be decided over the next 3 weeks, and we'll find out the answers in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.